Last Friday night, I was standing in my tiny kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator in my ears when the numbers on my lottery ticket lined up one by one. By the time I read the last one, my knees felt weak. $650 million. After taxes. My name is Valerie Monroe, and in that moment, I could have called anyone. My parents. My siblings. Even my best friend, but I didn't. Because I already knew what would happen if I did. You see, in my family, money has a way of turning love into something that keeps score. So instead, I made a different choice. I told no one. Not even Olivia, the one person who had never let me down. I decided to test them. I would show up in their living rooms and tell them I had lost my job, that I was drowning in bills, and all I needed was an $8,000 loan to get by. And while I expected some to turn away, I never imagined just how quickly the people I thought I knew would show me exactly where I stood, or who the two people would be who proved me completely wrong. That Friday morning had started like any other, with nothing to hint at how the night would change everything. The smell of burnt coffee drifted from the office kitchenette, mixing with the faint scent of printer toner that seemed to cling to every corner of Lux Reach marketing. I sat at my desk tapping numbers into a spreadsheet while Mark, my boss, stood a few feet away telling a client on speakerphone about the brilliant financial strategy he had supposedly come up with. I recognized every word because I had written the proposal myself. He didn't even glance my way. Derek was across the room scrolling on his phone, laughing quietly at something on the screen while his work sat untouched. It was just another Friday in Austin. Payday had already been eaten up by rent, groceries, and a car payment that was a month away from being late again. My savings account looked more like a rounding error than a cushion. I took a slow sip from my lukewarm coffee and told myself to get through the day. By 4:30, I had finished all the work on my plate and half of Derek's. Mark stopped by my desk on his way out, dropping a manila folder without meeting my eyes. He said he'd need it finalized by Monday and that he had an early dinner to get to. I wanted to tell him where he could put his dinner, but instead I smiled and said sure. I drove through the familiar streets of South Austin with the windows cracked, letting in the early spring air. My hands itched for something normal, a small ritual I never skipped. At the corner near South Lamar, the neon sign for Gus's Quick Mart blinked like it always did, the top half of the U flickering. Gus Ramirez had been running that store since before I could drive. I stepped inside and the bell above the door chimed. Gus looked up from stocking gum and grinned. "Evening, Valerie," he said. "Your usual, you know me too well," I replied. I had been buying the same type of lottery ticket every Friday for over a decade. Most weeks it was just a harmless habit, a few dollars toward a dream I didn't really expect to come true. But tonight was my birthday, and I decided to do something different. I filled out the slip using numbers from the birthdays of my family members. My dad, Richard, my mom, Elaine, my sister, Jenna, my brother, Dylan, even my aunt, Sylvia. As I handed Gus the slip and a crumpled $10 bill, I thought about each of them. Dad and Patricia, his second wife, living in their Dallas suburb, with the kind of tight-lipped formality that made family dinners feel like board meetings. Mom and Martin down in San Antonio, always busy with her flower shop and his endless property ventures. Jenna and her doctor husband Evan in Houston, posting photos of their remodeled kitchen like it was the Sistine Chapel. Dylan somewhere between jobs and excuses, who I hadn't seen sober in months. Aunt Marjorie with her luxury handbags and her son Ryan, both of them with a knack for reminding you how well they were doing. Only Sylvia, my mom's younger sister, had ever been consistently kind. She lived modestly in a small bungalow and taught part-time at the community college. She never asked for anything. I drove home with the ticket tucked in my wallet, tossed my purse on the couch, and made myself a microwaved burrito. The television played softly in the background, a news anchor talking about a massive jackpot winner somewhere in Texas. I barely listened until I heard the name of the store. Gus's Quick Mart. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. The announcer read the winning numbers and my heart kicked against my ribs. I dug my wallet out, pulled the ticket free, and ran my finger down the row. One by one, every number matched. My breath caught. I checked again, slower this time, saying each number aloud. It didn't feel real. My hands shook so badly I had to set the ticket down on the counter. My phone buzzed with a text from Olivia, my best friend since college, asking if I wanted to meet for drinks. I stared at the screen, unable to decide if I should tell her or even if I could get words out at all. I didn't. Instead, I opened my laptop and started searching. How to claim lottery winnings in Texas. How to stay anonymous. What happens when your family finds out? The stories were a mix of fairy tales and horror films. People who lost everything to bad investments, people sued by relatives, friendships torn apart. By midnight, I was still sitting at the kitchen table with the ticket in front of me, lit by the glow of my desk lamp. My apartment felt both too small and too exposed. I imagined my phone lighting up with calls from every corner of my family once the news broke. I imagined Mark finding out and suddenly remembering my name. Outside, the street was quiet. I made myself a promise I didn't know I could keep yet. No one was going to know. Not my parents, not my siblings, not even Olivia. Not until I figured out exactly what to do with more money than I had ever dreamed possible. I poured myself a glass of water and glanced at the ticket one more time. The numbers stared back like a secret I hadn't decided whether to love or fear. I turned off the light and let the kitchen fall into darkness, my mind racing with what this meant and what it could cost me. The next morning, the sunlight pushed through my blinds far earlier than I was ready for. My head felt heavy, not from lack of sleep exactly, but from the weight of everything I had learned in the last 12 hours. I sat up, reached for my phone, and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Harold Jennings. Harold was a friend of a friend, a lawyer in downtown Austin who specialized in some of the more unusual corners of Texas law. I had only met him once at a dinner party, but I remembered how he talked about asset protection like it was an art form. When I called, he answered on the second ring, his voice calm and warm like it was any other Saturday. By 10:30, I was sitting across from him in a sleek office on Congress Avenue, the kind of place where the carpet swallowed your footsteps and the walls smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Harold closed the glass door, glanced toward it to be sure it was shut tight, and then leaned forward. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. I slid the folded ticket across his desk. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the numbers, and then he exhaled through his teeth. "Valerie, you just stepped into an entirely different life." I nodded. "I want to stay anonymous. I don't want my name anywhere." "In Texas you can do that, but only if you set things up properly," he explained. "We form a trust, then an LLC, and have the trust claim the prize. That way your name never appears on any public record. After taxes, you will walk away with roughly $650 million. Invested wisely, that can easily grow into over $1 billion within a decade." The number barely registered. It felt like a movie I was watching about someone else, but when he slid a yellow legal pad toward me and began outlining steps, my focus sharpened. Bank appointments. Investment managers. A private mailbox in a different part of town. I told him I didn't want anyone in my family to know. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." He tilted his head. "That's not uncommon, but you should prepare for how much self-control it will take." I thought of the years of helping them when no one helped me back. The time Jenna called crying about her credit card debt and I quietly paid it off only for her to post about her new designer bag a week later. The time Dylan's truck broke down and I drained my savings to get him back on the road and he didn't even send a text of thanks. My father's promises to help with my college tuition that never materialized. My mother's polite silence when I asked for a loan during my layoff in my 20s. The decision settled in my chest like a stone. I wanted to truly know who would stand by me if I had nothing to offer them. I told Harold my plan. I would tell them I had lost my job and needed to borrow $8,000 to keep my apartment. Just enough to be a stretch, but not impossible. I would approach them one at a time, a few days apart, and see who answered the call. Harold considered it for a moment, tapping his pen against the desk. "Spread it over 4 weeks. People talk even in families that claim they don't. The more time you give between each approach, the less likely word will travel before you're ready." "That makes sense," I said. He gave me a small smile. Just remember whatever they say, or do you can't react in the moment. Keep your face neutral, let them show you who they are. Walking out of his office, the air felt cooler, the noise of downtown Austin sharper than usual. I stopped at a coffee cart on the corner, ordered a latte, and sat on a bench to think. The city moved around me in its usual rhythm, people in workout gear, jogging past others, balancing paper cups and laptops. No one knew that the woman sitting here sipping coffee could, if she wanted, buy the entire block. Back in my apartment, I pulled out a notebook and wrote a list of names. Dad. Mom. Jenna. Dylan. Aunt Marjorie. Ryan. I left Sylvia for last because in my heart I was already sure of her. I also wrote Olivia's name in the margin, not because I doubted her, but because I needed to see if even my best friend could resist temptation. The rest of the weekend was spent in preparation. I cleared out my work bag, removing anything that tied me to my job. I printed out a fake termination letter using an old company template I found online, adjusting the date to last week. I made sure my apartment looked just a little tighter financially, an overdue bill on the counter, an empty fridge except for milk and bread. Sunday night, I called Harold to confirm the trust documents would be ready in 2 weeks. He said he would handle the claiming process in the meantime using a courier, so I never had to appear in person. As I hung up, I felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. This was no longer just about money. It was about truth stripped bare and unpolished. I poured myself another glass of water and looked at the list again. The first name to test would be my father. I folded the paper, slipped it into the back of my planner, and let the apartment fall into silence. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once, then quieted. I leaned back on the couch, letting the hum of the refrigerator fill the space while I imagined the conversations to come, each one a small step towards seeing exactly where I stood in the family I thought I knew. The morning light came in thin stripes across my living room floor, catching the edge of the coffee table where I had left my planner. I reached for it almost without thinking, flipping past the neat pages of work notes until my fingers found the folded paper tucked inside. The list I had made last night was still there, each name written in my careful handwriting, each memory attached like a weight I could not put down. I carried it to the kitchen table along with a mug of coffee and began rewriting it, this time adding dates, amounts, and little reminders about what each situation had really been like. It felt almost clinical, but it helped to see the numbers in black and white. Dad Richard Monroe, 61, retired early after a back injury, but somehow still found ways to buy himself new golf clubs every other year. Patricia, his wife, 60, polite in public, but quick to remind me that her side of the family was different. 2 years ago, I wired Dad $2,500 when their AC gave out in July. Patricia had once called me in tears over a $700 property tax bill, and I had handled it without a word. Mama Lane Carter, 59, remarried to Martin, a man who had perfected the art of talking about investments he never actually made. I had learned not to ask for help after she sent me $200 when my old Corolla broke down in San Antonio, but only after making me promise to think about the choices that led me there. Jenna, my younger sister, 32, the picture of social media perfection with her physician husband Evan. I had covered $5,000 for her credit card debt, $1,800 for a spa weekend, $1,200 for a surprise tax bill. The total was a blur, somewhere north of $20,000. Every repayment promise faded after a few cheerful texts and then silence. Dylan, 35, my older brother, still chasing the idea of himself as an artist. 3 separate rent bailouts, each larger than the last. The final was $3,000 sent with the condition that he get a job. A week later, his Instagram showed him at a rooftop party in Miami. Aunt Marjorie, Dad's older sister, wealthy enough to donate to museums and attend black tie galas. Her son Ryan, 28, had run 3 tech startups in as many years, each one bleeding cash. Last Christmas, I had sent him $5,000 so his employees could get paid. I never even got a thank you card. And then Sylvia, my mother's sister, 73, who still sent me care packages when I was in college, even though she lived on a teacher's pension. She would be part of the test too, not because I doubted her, but because I wanted to see her reaction when she thought I was in trouble. At the very bottom, almost as an afterthought, I wrote down Carol Whitman, my 70-year-old neighbor. She lived alone at the end of the hall, a widow with a tidy apartment and a porch plant. She talked to more than she talked to people. We'd never shared more than small talk, but sometimes strangers reveal more than family ever will. By the time I put the pen down, my coffee was cold. The paper in front of me was more than just a list. It was a map of where my time, energy, and money had gone over the years. I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity, as if I were finally seeing the architecture of my own enabling. My phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. Olivia's name lit up the screen. She had that uncanny ability to check in when my mind was already crowded. "Hey, you sound off," she said after I answered. "Is something going on?" "Just work, stress." I told her the same lie I decided on last night. Month-end reports are a nightmare. She offered to bring dinner over, but I said no. I needed the space, the quiet, the distance to stay focused. When we hung up, I turned back to the list and began another column. This one wasn't about what I had given, but about what I would say to each person. I planned to tell them I had lost my job unexpectedly and needed to borrow $8,000 to cover expenses for the next few months. I'd make it sound urgent, but not desperate, believable, but not theatrical. The plan was to space out each conversation by a few days, just as Harold had advised. 4 weeks in total. Enough time to see patterns to avoid word getting around too soon. I would start with Mom. She was the one who loved to repeat that family takes care of each other. I wanted to see if that extended beyond her favorite anecdotes. I spent the rest of the morning rehearsing how I might phrase it. Should I call her or show up in person? A phone call could be too easy to dodge, but an unannounced visit might tip her off. Eventually, I decided on a video call. That way I could read her face, watch her eyes, and still have the safety of distance. Before I closed my notebook, I added a note in the margin: record observations after each call. I wanted to remember not just the words, but the pauses, the tones, the little tells people give off when they are deciding whether to say yes or no. The sun had shifted by the time I pushed back from the table, throwing long slants of light across the floor. I gathered the papers, slipped them back into my planner, and set it on the counter where I could see it. Tomorrow would be the start of something I couldn't undo once it began. The first test. The first measure of who they really were when I had nothing to give them but a chance to show up. I rinsed my coffee mug, letting the water run until it turned warm, then set it in the rack. The apartment was still the kind of stillness that felt like holding your breath before a long swim. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of a car pulling into the lot and the soft slam of a door. Somewhere a radio played an old country song. I sat back down, closed my eyes for a moment, and pictured my mother's face on the screen, the conversation already beginning in my mind. Tomorrow, the real work would start. The drive to San Antonio was warmer than I expected for early March, the kind of heat that seeps through the windshield even with the AC running. I kept the radio low, more for company than for music, and went over the details in my head. I had rehearsed the lines so many times they felt almost natural now. Lost my job. Short on paying a few medical bills. Need some help to get through the next couple of months. $8,000. It was just enough to make it real, but not enough to seem like I was asking for something life-changing. Elaine's house was a modest single story with a wide porch painted in a pale yellow that matched the flowers blooming in pots along the railing. She opened the door before I could knock, smiling, then pulling me into a quick hug. For a moment, I almost forgot why I was there. Martin appeared behind her in his usual uniform of pressed khakis and a button down, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. We moved to the living room where a bouquet of lilies sat on the coffee table, their scent heavy in the air. Elaine poured iced tea into tall glasses and asked about my drive. I waited until the small talk wound down before leaning forward in my chair. "Mom, I need to tell you something," I began, letting my voice catch slightly. "I lost my job last week. It was sudden. The company downsized and my position was cut. I'm trying to figure things out, but right now I'm behind on some medical bills from last year. I was hoping you might be able to help me out until I get back on my feet." Her expression softened immediately, concern flashing across her face. "Oh, honey, that's awful. Are you okay? What are you going to do?" I explained that I was already applying for new jobs, but I needed about $8,000 to keep everything covered for the next few months. I could feel Martin shift in his seat before he even spoke. $8,000 is a lot of money, Valerie, he said, folding his arms. Maybe you could sell your car. Or move back in here for a while until things settle. That way you could save on rent and utilities. Elaine glanced at him, then back at me. We just opened the flower shop, she said, her tone almost apologetic. The first few months are always tight and Martin is still working on that real estate deal. I wish we could, but we just don't have that kind of money right now. I nodded slowly, letting the silence sit. I had half expected this, but the speed with which they moved from concern to excuses still stung. It was as if the idea of inconvenience outweighed any memory of the times I had stepped in for them. I appreciate you listening, I said quietly, finishing my tea in a slow swallow. Martin launched into a story about a friend who had been laid off and rebuilt his career from scratch, clearly steering the conversation away from my request. Elaine nodded along, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When I stood to leave, Elaine hugged me again, but it was different this time, lighter, as if to signal that the subject was closed. Call me if you need anything else, she said, though we both knew that anything else didn't include what I had just asked for. Outside, the late afternoon sun was sharper, making me squint as I walked to my car. I sat for a moment with the engine off, scribbling a few notes in my planner. Concerned at first. Quickly shifted to financial excuses, offered alternatives that benefited them more than me. No actual offer of help. The drive back to Austin felt longer. I replayed the conversation in my head, every pause and change in tone. There was no anger in me, only a steady, quiet disappointment. I had given them the opportunity to show up and they hadn't taken it. By the time I reached my apartment, the sky had deepened into a dusty blue. I set my bag down, poured a glass of water, and stood by the window watching the streetlights flicker on. Tomorrow would bring another visit, another conversation. The pattern was starting to take shape. The highway to Dallas was lined with bare trees and billboards, promising weekend getaways, their bright colors muted by a hazy winter sun. I kept the air on low and my mind steady, focusing on the script I had already rehearsed. My father had always been a man of few words, and those words were rarely warm. Patricia, on the other hand, had a way of making hers sound sweet even when they cut deep. Their house sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with identical driveways and manicured lawns. Patricia opened the door before I could ring the bell, her perfume hitting me first, floral with something sharper underneath. She smiled, a careful up and down glance that felt more like an appraisal than a greeting, and stepped aside to let me in. My father was in his usual recliner, reading, glasses on, a muted news channel flickering on the television. He didn't stand when I walked in, just nodded once and gestured toward the couch. We made small talk about the drive, the weather, and a local road closure. Patricia disappeared into the kitchen and returned with coffee in white porcelain cups. The moment I set mine down, I leaned forward. I lost my job last week, I said, keeping my tone even. It was sudden, and I'm a little behind on some bills, including medical expenses. I was hoping you might be able to help me out, maybe just for a couple of months until I'm back on my feet. My father's expression didn't shift much, but his jaw tightened. You know, Valerie, this is exactly why we had that discussion years ago, he said, voice low. When you refused to contribute to the family fund, I told you there would be a day when you might need it. I held his gaze, resisting the urge to remind him that the so-called family fund had been more about Patricia's side projects than any collective emergency. Patricia, sitting on the arm of the couch, gave a soft laugh. Richard is right. You've never been good with money. Maybe if you sold some of your jewelry, you could cover those bills without asking anyone. I swallowed the heat that rose in my chest. I'm not asking for a gift. I can pay it back in a few months. Patricia tilted her head, her voice lilting. It's not that we don't want to help, dear. We're just saving for a trip to Europe this summer. You understand, don't you? My father gave a curt nod as if the matter was settled. I finished my coffee, each sip bitter in my mouth. The conversation drifted to their travel plans, the cities they wanted to visit, and the restaurants Patricia had already bookmarked. Her eyes lit up as she described the shopping in Milan, and then almost as an afterthought she reached down beside the couch and lifted a glossy paper bag. "Look what I found yesterday," she said, pulling out a designer handbag, the logo gleaming in the light. "It's the new season, I couldn't resist." She set it on the coffee table between us, the faint smell of new leather mixing with the coffee and her perfume. My father smiled, running a hand over the bag as if it were something rare and precious. I nodded, murmuring something polite, but my mind was already somewhere else. I was picturing the list in my planner and the notes I would add when I got home. Dismissed request. Reference to past grievance. Accusations about financial habits. Public display of discretionary spending immediately after refusal. When I stood to leave, my father walked me to the door but didn't hug me. Patricia gave me another air kiss, her manicured fingers light on my arm. "Drive safe," she said, as though my $8,000 request had never existed. Outside, the air was cooler than it had been all day. I walked to my car slowly, the sound of my heels on the driveway sharp against the quiet street. Sliding into the driver's seat, I sat for a moment watching the sunlight fade behind the row of houses. There was no anger in me, only the kind of clarity that comes when someone shows you exactly who they are. The engine hummed to life, and I steered back toward the freeway, the miles ahead stretching out like the rest of the week, full of faces I thought I knew and answers I could already predict. Houston greeted me with its usual mix of humidity and skyline, the glass towers catching the late morning sun as I wound my way through traffic toward Jenna's neighborhood. She and Evan had bought into one of those gated communities with winding drives, manicured hedges, and fountains at the entrance, the kind of place that looked like it belonged on the cover of a luxury home magazine. Her white SUV was parked in the driveway, gleaming like it had just come from the dealership. The front yard was dotted with fresh landscaping, new rose bushes, a young magnolia tree, and a delivery van idled at the curb. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon polish. Jenna was in yoga pants and a cashmere sweater, her hair pulled into one of those perfectly messy buns that I knew took at least 20 minutes to style. "Val," she said, pulling me into a quick hug before stepping back. "You made it. Sorry for the mess, the kitchen's under renovation." I followed her in and saw what she meant. Half the cabinets were gone, the counters stripped bare, and a new marble island sat in the center covered with swatches of tile and fixture catalogs. She poured us both sparkling water, her gold bracelet catching the light as she set the glass in front of me. "So, how's work?" she asked, leaning on the island. I took a slow breath. "Actually, that's kind of why I came. I lost my job last week. There's some medical stuff I've been paying off, and I'm in a tight spot. I was hoping I could borrow about $8,000. Just for a few months." Her expression softened at first, brows knitting together as she reached for her glass. "Oh Val, that's awful. But $8,000 is, well, I mean, that's a lot to ask without talking to Evan first. You know how he is about big expenses." Before I could answer, I heard footsteps behind me. Evan appeared wearing a golf shirt and khaki shorts, holding a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. "What's this about money?" he asked, his voice neutral in that way that meant it wasn't. Jenna glanced at him, then back at me. "Val needs a short-term loan just until she gets back on her feet." Evan set his phone down on the counter and took a sip of coffee. $8,000? That's not exactly pocket change. I mean, if you need cash fast, there are other ways. Like what?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He shrugged. "Well, you've got that necklace, right? The one your mom gave you. You could probably get a decent amount for it if you took it to the right place." Jenna didn't say anything, just reached for a tile sample and set it back down. I stared at him for a moment. "That necklace is the only thing I have from her. Selling it isn't an option." Evan nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. "Just saying, sometimes you have to be practical." The silence that followed was thick enough to make the sound of a saw starting up outside seem too loud. I finished my water and stood setting the glass gently on the counter. "Thanks for the advice, but I think I'll figure something out on my own." Jenna walked me to the door, her smile polite but distant now, as though the conversation had shifted something she didn't want to examine too closely. Evan stayed in the kitchen scrolling through his phone. The sun was warmer than I expected when I stepped outside, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass from a nearby lawn service. I got into my car and glanced back at the house, catching a glimpse of Jenna in the doorway, arms folded, watching me leave. As I pulled away, I made a mental note for my list: feigned concern, immediate deferral to spouse, suggestion to sell personal heirloom, no commitment to help. Another square filled and another pattern confirmed. The road out of the neighborhood wound past more houses, all variations of wealth on display, each driveway lined with cars that gleamed like new coins. By the time I reached the main road, the conversation had settled into the same category as the others, not surprising but still sharp in its own way. Traffic thickened as I merged onto the freeway, the Houston skyline fading in the rearview. I kept my eyes ahead, already thinking of the next visit and what I might hear there, the city limits giving way to stretches of road that would carry me closer to the next answer. Dylan answered on the second ring, his voice low and groggy, like I had just pulled him out of bed. I told him the same story I had told the others about losing my job and facing medical bills I couldn't handle. My words were steady, measured, like I was balancing on a line between desperation and dignity. There was a pause on his end, just long enough for me to hear the faint creak of a floorboard and the muffled sound of a television in the background. "Yeah, that's rough," he finally said with a slow exhale. "Things have been tight for me too, you know how it is. But I'll see what I can do. Maybe move some things around. I'll call you." I thanked him, though the tone in his voice already told me what was coming. That distance, that vagueness, was the sound of someone who had already decided they couldn't or wouldn't help. 2 days passed without a call. On the third, I was driving through the east side of town after picking up groceries when a splash of neon caught my eye. It was the sign for a bar I hadn't been to in years, one Dylan used to frequent. The glow from the windows spilled out onto the sidewalk, and through the glass I caught a glimpse of him. He was leaning against the counter, a beer in one hand, laughing with 2 men I didn't recognize. A basket of wings sat in the middle of their table, and his credit card was already in the bartender's hand. I slowed, then pulled into a parking space without giving myself time to think better of it. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of fried food, beer, and cigarette smoke wrapped around me. Music thumped low from the speakers, and the place was lit by a mix of dim overhead bulbs and flickering beer signs. Dylan spotted me mid-sip, his expression tightening in a way that confirmed he hadn't expected to see me there. "Val, hey," he said, slipping away from the table and forcing a small smile. "What are you doing here?" I replied, keeping my eyes on him. "But I drove by and saw you. Since you never called me back, I figured I'd check in." He rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes shifting toward the bar where his tab was still open. "Yeah. About that. Things have been complicated. Complicated enough that you can't pick up the phone, but not complicated enough to buy rounds for your friends." His jaw tightened, his smile gone. "That's different. This is my money." I held his gaze. "And the money I've given you over the years. Rent when you were broke. The time I paid for your transmission repair. That was my money too." He let out a small scoff. "That was then. I didn't ask you to." "No, you didn't. But I thought that's what family did." He glanced toward the door like he was already done with the conversation. "Look, Val, I can't help you right now. That's all there is to it. You can't or you won't." He didn't answer. Instead, he gave a quick nod as if to close the matter and moved back toward his table. The laughter picked up again almost instantly, the sound rolling out toward me as if nothing had happened. I stood there for a moment, the bar suddenly feeling smaller and more claustrophobic. A woman at the end of the counter looked up from her drink to glance between us, her expression unreadable. I turned and walked out into the cooler air, the night buzzing with the sound of traffic on the nearby highway. In my car, I sat with my hands on the wheel, watching Dylan through the windshield as he leaned in toward his friends. He looked relaxed, almost carefree, the kind of comfort that comes from knowing you won't be the one answering a late-night call for help. I drove away slowly, the tires humming against the pavement. Every mile I put between us made the knot in my chest loosen, but it didn't disappear. I thought back to the list in my notebook, the neat lines of names and the empty boxes beside them. I could already see how his would be marked. By the time I reached the edge of downtown, the streets were quieter, lined with dark storefronts and the occasional flicker of a security light. I stopped at a red light and caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror, my face calmer than I felt. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about clarity. When I pulled into my apartment complex, I parked and sat for a moment before heading inside. The hallway was quiet, the hum of the vending machine, the only sound. In my kitchen, I poured a glass of water and took a slow sip, the coolness grounding me. I opened my planner, flipped to the page, and wrote Dylan's name in firm, steady strokes. Next to it, I added 2 words, not willing. Closing the planner, I let it rest on the counter. The fridge hummed, the pipes in the wall groaned softly, and the weight of the day settled into my shoulders. Tomorrow would bring another face, another conversation, another truth to add to the list. The driveway curved like a private road, lined with trimmed hedges and lit by soft ground lights that made the whole place feel like an estate ad in a glossy magazine. Marjorie's house rose at the end, all white stone and wide windows, the kind of property that seemed designed to be admired from a distance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of jasmine and something rich baking in the oven, though I doubted she had touched a mixing bowl in years. The living room was full of people in clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Marjorie spotted me from across the room and swept over, her gold bangles clinking softly with each step. She kissed my cheek without really making contact, her smile polished but cool. "Valerie, you made it. I almost didn't think you would." I told her I'd been looking forward to it, though we both knew it wasn't true. She led me toward a seating area where a man in a tailored navy suit was holding court over a group of laughing guests. Ryan sat beside him, wearing a crisp white shirt and the kind of grin that came from knowing everyone here respected his last name more than anything he had actually accomplished. We exchanged pleasantries, sipped champagne, and listened while Marjorie told a story about her early career. She made it sound like she had clawed her way up from nothing, though I remembered the family money that had been there all along. At one point, she placed a hand lightly on my shoulder and said in front of the group, "You know, Valerie, everyone faces hard times. You just have to learn to push through without expecting someone to fix it for you." Her tone was sweet enough to pass for encouragement, but I felt the sting beneath it. I smiled and said nothing, letting the moment pass. After dinner, Ryan caught up to me near the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, speaking in a low voice. "I heard about what you're going through. I can help." I waited, sensing the hook before he threw it. "I'll give you the $8,000 you need," he said, "but in exchange, I want a contract. 10% of any profits you make from your next project. Whatever that ends up being." I stared at him, trying to decide if he was serious. "My next project." He nodded, looking pleased with himself. "You're smart, you'll land on your feet. Think of it as an investment in your future." I let out a small laugh, more out of disbelief than humor. "So I give you 10% of something I haven't even built yet, just so I can get through a rough month?" "Exactly. It's a win-win." I shook my head. "No, Ryan. That's not help. That's a deal for you, not for me." His jaw tightened and he pushed away from the counter. "Then, I guess there's nothing else to talk about." He left the room without another word, his cologne hanging in the air behind him. I stayed another 20 minutes, making small talk until it felt polite enough to leave. Driving back through the gates, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was calm, but my hands on the wheel were stiff, my knuckles pale. 2 days later, I was making coffee when my phone buzzed. A notification from the family Facebook group popped up. Marjorie had posted a photo of herself on her patio, a glass of wine in hand. The caption read, "Some people think acting desperate will get them what they want. Life doesn't work that way, you earn what you have." The comments were full of nodding emojis and affirmations from relatives who had no idea what she was referring to, though I didn't need to guess. I scrolled once, set the phone down, and let the coffee finish brewing. I poured a cup and took it to the table, opening my planner again. Under her name, I wrote the same words I had for Dylan. Not willing. The ink spread slightly into the paper, fibers, the letters looking darker than the rest. The apartment was quiet except for the steady drip of the coffee maker cooling down. Outside, a light breeze moved the branches of the oak tree near my window. I watched them sway for a moment, letting the irritation settle into something steadier. This was becoming a pattern I could read without effort. And there were still more names to go. Sylvia called mid-morning, her voice warm but carrying that familiar quiet urgency. She said she had been thinking about me and wondered if I could meet her for lunch. No preamble, no explanation, just the kind of invitation she gave when she had already made up her mind about something. I agreed, and by noon, I was parking in front of a small diner tucked between a hardware store and a laundromat on the south side of town. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of coffee and grilled onions. Sylvia was already seated in a corner booth, a glass of iced tea sweating on the table in front of her. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and she gave me the same smile she'd been giving me since I was 8 years old and came to her for cookies after school. We started with small talk. She told me about a new student in her English class at the community college, a young man who wrote poetry about stray dogs. I told her about the weather in Austin, the traffic on I-35, the price of gas. It felt easy the way it always did with her. She never asked questions in a way that made you feel like you were being cornered. After a while, she set her glass down, folded her hands together, and leaned forward. "I heard you lost your job, Val." "Is it true?" I nodded, repeating the same carefully rehearsed story I had been telling everyone for the past couple of weeks. She listened quietly, not interrupting, her brow creased just enough to let me know she was paying attention. When I finished, she reached into her purse and pulled out a plain white envelope, sliding it across the table. I stared at it, my hand hovering over the flap. "What is this?" "Open it," she said. Inside was a neat stack of bills. $4,000 in 20s and hundreds, folded so precisely it looked like she had counted it twice. "Sylvia, I can't." "Yes, you can. And you will." She pushed it closer. "I've been saving a little here and there for years. It's not a fortune, but it might help you get through this rough patch. And if it doesn't, you come stay with me. No rent, no strings." Her tone was gentle but firm, the kind that left no room for argument. I knew she wasn't a woman of means. She worked part-time, lived modestly, and carried the quiet burden of managing her diabetes without complaint. This wasn't extra money. This was safety, comfort, and she was handing it to me without hesitation. I felt my throat tighten. "Thank you." "Really, I don't know how to put into words what this means." "You don't need to. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself." We lingered after the plates had been cleared, drifting back into lighter topics, but the envelope sat between us like an unspoken truth. By the time we hugged goodbye in the parking lot, I could feel the weight of it in my bag, heavier than paper and ink had any right to be. When I got home, the apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I had barely set my keys on the counter when there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Carroll stood there holding a wicker basket wrapped in cellophane, her smile tentative. "I heard from Linda next door that things have been tough for you lately. Thought maybe this could help." She handed it to me before I could protest. Inside was a loaf of banana bread, a jar of homemade strawberry jam, and tucked under the ribbon an envelope. "Carol, I can't accept." "You can," she interrupted softly. "It's just a little something to get you through." After she left, I set the basket on the counter and opened the envelope. A check for $500. Her handwriting in the memo line read, "Just in case." I stood there staring at it, the late afternoon light slanting across the kitchen. 2 women, 1 family, 1 neighbor had reached into their own pockets without me asking. No conditions, no sideways comments about selling my car or moving in with someone. Just help freely given. I took out my planner and wrote Sylvia's name, underlining it twice. Beside it, I wrote willing. Below that, I added Carol's name, circling it carefully. The rest of the list still waited, but for the first time since I'd begun this test, I felt something solid under my feet. The pattern I had been seeing so clearly was now split in 2. And I knew even before the final conversations which side of that line these names would fall on. It started with a vague post on the family Facebook group, something about how people should be careful not to play the victim to get handouts. No names, just a carefully planted seed. By the next morning, my phone was lighting up with screenshots from people I barely talked to, asking if I had seen what was being said. By lunchtime, the whispers had turned into full conversations. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years tagged me under a post about self-reliance. Someone else shared an article about budgeting with a comment that felt aimed directly at me. It was subtle enough that strangers might miss it, but everyone in the family circle knew exactly who they were talking about. Then Jenna's text came in. It wasn't subtle at all. She accused me of making the family look bad, said I had gone around telling sob stories to anyone who would listen and that Evan was furious people might think they hadn't helped. Her words were sharp and fast, like she had typed them without pausing for breath. I read it twice before replying with a single line noted. I put the phone face down and went back to my work laptop. That silence from me seemed to ignite something because within the hour she sent 3 more messages. Each one was shorter, more clipped, and angrier. I didn't answer any of them. By midweek, the ripple effect started to hit in ways I hadn't expected. Dylan's name came up in a news alert on my phone. He was being sued by a former landlord for unpaid rent and property damage. The story wasn't big enough to make headlines outside the county, but it was enough to circulate through the same Facebook group that had been dissecting me days earlier. Suddenly the comments were about how some people never learn and living beyond your means always catches up. No one tagged Dylan directly, but they didn't have to. 2 days later, I heard from a mutual contact that Jenna had lost a major client at her design firm. The client had canceled a lucrative contract citing unprofessional communication after an email chain was leaked. I didn't know if it was related to the way she handled her personal life, but I knew how much that deal had meant to her. And Marjorie, the queen of self-made speeches, had apparently put a large sum into an overseas property investment that was now tied up in a fraud investigation. It wasn't public yet, but the fact that Ryan had been bragging about it at a barbecue meant it wouldn't be long before people started asking questions. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Karma seemed to be keeping its own pace, and I was too busy managing my own day-to-day to dwell on theirs. At the office, things weren't any quieter. Mark called me into his office and dropped a stack of folders on my desk. A new client had signed on, one with a reputation for being demanding and detail-obsessed, and Mark said he wanted me to take the lead. The smile he gave me was thin, the kind that looked more like a warning than a compliment. Derek, on the other hand, seemed thrilled by this development. I caught him in the break room later leaning against the counter with a coffee in hand telling another coworker that I was a natural fit for the project because I could handle stress better than anyone. What he didn't mention was that he had been assigned as my support on the account and was already looking for ways to disappear when the real work started. That first week on the project, I found myself at my desk, long after most of the office had gone home, the only sound the low hum of the HVAC and the occasional pop of the elevator doors opening and closing down the hall. My phone would buzz with another family group notification, but I didn't open them. One night, as I was gathering my things, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. I looked tired but not defeated. The noise from my family's opinions and the petty jabs online felt farther away than they had in years. The chatter would keep going. It always did. But I had work to finish, both the kind Mark was paying me for and the kind no one else knew I was doing. And every passing day was bringing me closer to the point where neither their approval nor their criticism would matter at all. I picked a Sunday for the gathering, the kind of day when people were more likely to show up out of habit than genuine interest. The invitations were short and plain, sent out individually so no one could compare notes. Just a small dinner in Austin, a chance to catch up. I kept the tone light with no hint that anything more was planned. By the time the day arrived, my apartment felt different, stripped of anything that might invite judgment. I moved furniture to make space, polished the table until it shone, and set out a spread that was generous but not extravagant. I didn't want anyone to walk in thinking they had proof I was better off than I'd let on. Sylvia was the first to arrive, right on the dot, carrying a homemade pie. She set it on the counter and hugged me like she meant it, the kind of hug that didn't need words. She told me I looked more rested than I had in weeks, and I let her believe it was true. Jenna and Evan came next, pulling up in a shiny SUV. Jenna's smile was tight, her eyes darting around the room as if she were scanning for something to criticize. Evan kept his hands in his pockets, his nod perfunctory, already half detached from the evening. My father walked in with Patricia, who wore a silk scarf in deep emerald that practically announced its price. Dad's greeting was clipped as if we were business acquaintances. Patricia gave me a once-over and a smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. Elaine and Martin arrived with a bottle of wine. Elaine chattering about how busy the shop had been, Martin wearing the smug look of a man who thinks every conversation should revolve around his investments. Dylan rolled in last 15 minutes late, smelling faintly of whiskey and acting as if his presence was a favor. We eased into small talk. Conversations broke into pockets, the clink of glasses filling the gaps. I let it go on until the plates were full and the first glasses of wine were half empty. Then I stood at the head of the table, my hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. I began by telling them I had accepted a new role at a nonprofit. I had founded one focused on providing financial literacy and emergency assistance to women starting over. I spoke plainly without embellishment about wanting to build something that could outlast me. Then I let my eyes sweep the table, and one by one I revisited the moments over the years when I had stepped in for them. Covering Dylan's rent when he lost his job. Paying Jenna and Evan's down payment. Clearing the debt Patricia's mother couldn't manage. Funding Elaine's floral shop expansion. Wiring money to Martin for a property deal. There were others smaller but no less telling, and I named them too. And then I shifted to the past month. How I had approached each of them with a simple request for a short-term loan framed as a bridge over a rough patch. How I had waited for their answers. How those answers had sounded. My voice stayed, even my words deliberate. Patricia was the first to react, her tone sharp as she said I had no right to blindside people at a dinner table. Jenna jumped in, accusing me of turning private conversations into some sort of performance. Dylan leaned back smirking and muttered that I'd always been good at playing the martyr. My father's face was unreadable, though his eyes had narrowed. Elaine glanced at Martin as if for direction, and Martin simply shrugged as if none of it concerned him. Sylvia, seated beside me, reached for my hand and held it, her grip firm. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. The voices rose, overlapping, some defensive, some angry, some just silent in a way that said more than words could. I waited, letting the noise burn itself out, then told them I wasn't here to ask for anything. I wasn't angry, I wasn't keeping score. I simply wanted to know where we all stood. The quiet that followed was thick, as if the air itself had weight. I looked from face to face and realized I didn't need to push further. The answers had been given long before tonight. Sylvia's thumb brushed against my hand, a small anchor in the stillness. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator clicked on, breaking the moment. I let go of her hand and took my seat again, the scrape of the chair legs loud in the hush. Dinner went on, but the taste of the food didn't matter. The real meal had already been served, and everyone at that table knew it. Morning light slips across my kitchen floor and catches on the edge of a terracotta pot where basil is trying its best to become a small forest. The house is quiet in a way that feels chosen rather than accidental. A year has passed since that dinner where I laid everything out and set the table with truths instead of dessert. I wake now to birds and the distant sound of a bus on South Lamar, and sometimes to the faint laugh of my Aunt Sylvia drifting across the 3 blocks between our homes when she is talking with a neighbor on her porch. Her place is a single-story bungalow with wide doorways and a walk-in shower with sturdy grab bars. We picked out the handrails together, argued lovingly over paint colors, and insisted on a front porch deep enough for 2 rocking chairs and a little table for iced tea. The first week she moved in, she called to tell me the sunrise from her kitchen window made even oatmeal taste like celebration. She looks stronger. Her blood sugar is steadier. Worry fell from her shoulders when a monthly stipend began arriving like clockwork and medical deliveries stopped being a math problem. On my side of the street, the house is modest by Texas standards, bright and comfortable with a desk by a window where I can watch storm clouds gather over the hill country. The kitchen smells like coffee most mornings, and the living room holds shelves of paperback novels I had promised myself I would read when life slowed down. Life did not slow down, but it changed shape. The nonprofit is real now, not just an idea scribbled in a notebook. We named it Open Porch Project because we wanted the kind of help that felt like sitting down with a neighbor, not filling out forms in a cold office. Olivia runs outreach with a kind of grounded joy that makes people open up. She trains volunteers, pairs them with seniors who need rides or phone calls or a set of strong hands to carry groceries up a flight of stairs. She never asks about the origin story that keeps the lights on. She just builds. We have helped 250 older adults in the Austin area this year. Sometimes it is a small grant to keep utilities from being shut off. Sometimes it is a ramp built over a weekend by a crew of teenagers who learn how to measure a corner and talk to someone who could be their grandmother. Sometimes it is just company of volunteers sitting at a kitchen table listening to a story that would otherwise echo in an empty room. The work feels clean. It feels like a ledger that balances in a language deeper than numbers. Harold checks in once a month with updates I do not always need to hear but appreciate anyway. The trust is healthy. The investment accounts are doing what they should do. There are safeguards and backups for safeguards. He likes to remind me that the best part of real security is forgetting you have it. He is right. There are days when I go from sunrise to bedtime without thinking about the size of the accounts hiding behind layers of paper. Money is a tool that answers yes quietly and quickly, but it is not a conversation anymore. My family rotates around the edges of my calendar like planets I no longer try to pull into perfect orbit. My father had a minor heart procedure in the spring. The hospital balance that insurance did not cover disappeared after an anonymous contribution from a patient assistance fund with a name that sounded like any other. He called afterwards to tell me he felt lucky. I told him I was glad he was all right. That was enough. Jenna recovered part of what she lost when the client walked away. There was a month where everything wobbled. An application from a small business relief program crossed the right desk and a grant arrived that covered her payroll during a slow quarter. She posted a photo of her team holding paper cups of cheap champagne and wrote that community matters. I tapped a heart and kept scrolling. Ryan entered an outpatient program this summer. He has 28 days now and a sponsor who texts him at sunrise. The program received a donation in memory of no one and in honor of nothing, and a line of credit at the pharmacy means his medications are waiting before his name appears on the screen. Dylan still moves between plans like a man walking along a tide line, always sure the next wave will lift him. He reached a settlement on the eviction case and found a room across town with rent that matches a pay stub he actually shows up to earn. A rent relief fund cut one check. He never knew why the property manager stopped circling dates on a calendar and started saying sounds good. Elaine sends photos of bouquets from the shop, sunflowers in late summer, winter greens in December, a little note about how business is steady. Martin is still chasing property deals. Patricia posted a picture from a cafe in Florence and tagged 3 museums in 2 days. My father sends a message on the first Sunday of each month that reads the same way it always has. Hope you are well. Talk soon. Sometimes they all gather without me. Birthdays, a barbecue, a graduation for a cousin's kid. The photos slide past in a feed I do not mute but do not study. When we speak, our words are careful. Weather traffic recipes. I do not try to rewrite what is true. I keep the door open to kindness and the windows shut against drafts I used to call love. On Thursdays, Sylvia and I eat dinner together. Sometimes I cook. Sometimes she does. More often we meet in the middle and walk to the taco stand that knows our order. She tells me stories from her classes. Students who work nights and arrive with eyes half closed. A grandmother learning how to write about the place she left behind. We laugh about small things. She squeezes my hand when parting and says the same sentence every time. You did good, kid. Mark still runs LuxReach with a tight jaw and a calendar full of meetings. Derek left unexpectedly after a client complained that emails went unanswered for a week. I took my name off a company badge and did not look back. There is a box in my closet with a few old notebooks and a mug with a hairline crack where my thumb used to rest. I thought I would miss it. I do not. There are mornings when I think about the night in my old apartment when the refrigerator hummed in the dark and a small piece of paper glowed like a dare. I thought money might answer the question of who I was. It did not. It just lit up the room so I could see who was already sitting with me and who had left long before I noticed. I kept the secret. That is the part people would argue with if they knew. Tell them, they would say, make them see what they gave up. But silence is not absence. It is a boundary. It lets the people who showed up be seen. It lets generosity stay clean. It keeps me from measuring love in payments and receipts. Once a month, we host a community dinner on the lawn behind the Open Porch Project office. Volunteers set long tables under strings of lights, and everyone brings something small. A woman in a denim jacket plays guitar. A veteran tells a story about a dog he met on a Tuesday who followed him home and stayed. Olivia walks the line of tables like a general and a grandmother at once, making sure plates are full and strangers become neighbors by the end of the night. I look for Sylvia's wave across the lawn, and she always gives it a little arc through the air that feels like a blessing. If there is a lesson in this year, it is quieter than I expected. Love is not debt. Help is not leverage. The people who deserve the softest parts of you are the ones who offer steady hands when you have nothing to trade but your own tired voice. Money did not change who anyone was. It just took the shadows off the corners and let me decide where to build. I lock up after the last dinner of the summer and walk home under a sky that holds more stars than the city usually allows. My porch light throws a small circle of gold across the steps. Inside, the house creaks the way old houses do when they are cooling after a hot day. I set my keys in the bowl by the door and stand for a moment in the quiet. The life I have now is not smaller or larger than the one I had before. It is simply mine. It fits. If you found yourself holding sudden wealth, would you tell someone right away, or would you keep quiet to see the truth in the people around you? Tell me what you would do and why. Share your own stories in the comments. Tap like if this journey meant something to you, and subscribe so you can be here for the next one.